Okay, good afternoon. This is Jung-Hoon Lee. I'm a professor of international relations at Yonsei University. I'm very happy to be moderating this panel titled A Nuclear North Korea, subtitle Nonproliferation Issues and Beyond. Nonproliferation. It's not a good time for the subject matter. I'm sure that this has been talked over and over again in the morning sessions, and this continues into the afternoon sessions. I'm sure we're not the only panel that will be discussing this issue. Obviously, there are many implications of the recent third nuclear test that's just been conducted in North Korea. And of course, one of which is the non-proliferation regime, which you might argue has not succeeded. It has failed to prevent North Korea from going ahead, proceeding along, progressing in its intent to become a bona fide, authentic, genuine nuclear state. And from the grapevines, or maybe very overtly, we feel that North Korea, we may not have seen the last of North Korea's nuclear tests. They're warning further, fourth, fifth, which simply indicates that North Korea may be very much bent on becoming a nuclear state. And if the third test proves to be not sufficient, then it will continue until it becomes sufficient. So we have three really outstanding panelists to gauge all this. What does it all mean? How do we absorb the third nuclear test? And what do we do if North Korea continues with fourth and fifth, and also increasing its capability in terms of the long-range delivery capability? And what does it all mean for the non-proliferation regime? Where do we go forward from this point onward? Should we be talking about a different approach in safekeeping or maintaining and making progress in the non-proliferation capacity? We have three speakers. Bruce Bennett, to my immediate left, Rand Corporation, who's been one of the top experts with a close watch on the North Korean nuclear issue. His previous positions: Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, U.S. Air Force. He's also been with the U.S. Forces Korea the U.S. Pacific Command, the Central Command. He specializes in strategy formulation, force requirements, and responding to the asymmetric threat, which is exactly what we have with North Korea. To his left is Professor Michishita Narushige, who is a professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, better known as GRIPS, in Japan. His previous positions include Senior Research Fellowship at the National Institute for Defense Studies in the Japanese Ministry of Defense, and also Deputy Director of the Bureau of Defense Policy. And finally, we have Mr. Alexander Vorontsov, who is the head of the Korean and Mongolian Studies Department at the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. His previous positions include Vice Secretary General for the International Society for Korean Studies, and also professor at the Military Science Academy of the Russian Federation. So without further ado, I will turn to my immediate left with Bruce, and who will maybe about 10 minutes. Would that be sufficient? We'll have about 10 minutes of some insights into the current developments and its implications for the non-proliferation. and then we'll have feedbacks from the audience, and hopefully it will lead to a lively and interesting dialogue. So Bruce?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity of being able to talk with you today. I've been very interested in the aftermath of the nuclear test, and even before, with the many media stories that have said, well, but North Korea will never use these nuclear weapons because if they do, the United States will turn it into a parking lot. Apparently originally attributed to Condoleezza Rice when she was Secretary of State. And yet, in my mind, North Korea uses these nuclear weapons every day. They haven't launched them, but they use them regularly. And so for us to understand the nature of this threat and our potential responses to it, both in terms of deterring it and in terms of negotiating with it, we have to understand those uses. It's not just one or two things. In fact, North Korea has a very rich menu that these weapons help them achieve in their objectives. And so let me just try to go through some of these things today. In many cases, I'll try to quote from North Korean sources, but in other cases, I'll simply try to explain the situation. I start with one of the uses that Vasily mentioned this morning, the blackmail use. North Korea trying to intimidate South Korea, the United States, other countries, and trying to gain aid in response to giving up nuclear weapons. Certainly been applied in the past. But their apparent argument in this last week that says, well, but we're going to go a step beyond that. We're going to do another 1 or 2 nuclear tests and maybe a space launch in order to force the United States to negotiate with us, is a new kind of coercion, a bolder kind of coercion. And it's important for us to note that because if this is a new pattern, which I suspect it may be, we have a whole new set of threats that we will be seeing in coming years. Number 2, they've used it to deter coercion against them and to deter attacks against them. They've been very clear, starting with the notion that North Korea was prepared to turn Seoul into a sea of fire from 20 years ago. Similar statements that say if war occurs in Korea, it will be waged with nuclear weapons rather than conventional ones. That if the United States ignites a nuclear war, the U.S. military bases in Japan would serve as a detonating fuse to turn Japan into a nuclear sea of fire. So North Korea postures these weapons in a deterrence perspective to try to deter attacks against it. This is only natural because North Korea tries to posit the United States and South Korea and even our Japanese allies as the enemies. Much as was mentioned this morning, they need to establish those enemies to have someone to blame for their failures. They need to have that adversarial situation to justify working on nuclear weapons and spending all the money they did in 1995 and 96 and 97 and letting people starve to death as they're spending money on nuclear weapons. These are important trades. We see lots of discussion in the media about the North Korean nuclear shadow. That's the technical term. Effectively, it says that North Korea feels more prepared to do provocations because they have nuclear weapons and because their opponents, us, are intimidated by the chance that we could get caught in an escalatory spiral that would lead to nuclear weapon use. And so we're going to be more careful. Heaven knows we've been careful enough with North Korea's provocations over the years. If you follow the chain of provocations, we've shown great restraint, especially South Korea has shown great restraint. But now there seems to be new, and many reporters say, and the U.S. nuclear umbrella hasn't stopped these provocations. I think it's important for us to understand it was never designed to do that. We need different tools for that purpose. North Korea also uses these nuclear weapons to demonstrate the empowerment of the leadership. You can't see that any more than the 2009 test when you have an ailing Kim Jong-il who actually looks pretty weak at the time. and needs to demonstrate that he really is still strong and empowered, and do it with one of the few tools he had to do that with. I mean, he didn't have an economy that he could claim was a sign of a strong leader, or much else in North Korea, but he did have nuclear weapons. You see actually a similar pattern now, with many debates about how much instability there really is in North Korea, different views, but I tend to believe that there's more than what we're seeing for a number of reasons. And I think in that kind of case, Kim Jong-un wants to again demonstrate his empowerment. I mean, think of his January 1st speech when he talks of the North Korean missile launch in December as the greatest event for North Korea of 2012. Gee, that's awfully disappointing for a country, isn't it? That the greatest event they have is a missile launch as opposed to feeding their people when that was a major commitment he had made. We also see that sort of thing as North Korea seeks to be declared a nuclear state. They want us to recognize them as a nuclear state. They want to have that demonstration to their people that we have given in on that issue. My response on that is to say, look, let's talk about reality. North Korea is an unsafe, non-compliant nuclear experimenter. It is not a nuclear power. Compare it to any of the other countries with nuclear weapons. It has nothing like the capabilities. It is still experimenting. It's very different, and we should call a spade and not give them the propaganda victory they wish. They also use that to support their diversionary effort, again to call us the enemy, again to focus people on the United States and South Korea as the enemy, as opposed to bearing responsibility for their own difficulties. They have used their nuclear weapons to affect perceptions of the military balance in the region. I see numerous references in the South Korean literature similar to this one from 2006, which says North Korea nuclear bomb reverses the military balance on the Korean peninsula, tilting it towards the north. Well, I don't entirely agree with that perspective, but I think there are reasons for thinking about it in those terms. I think it's a concern. North Korea has used its nuclear weapons also to stimulate interest in the goods and services that it can provide, which in a competitive worldwide environment aren't many. They tend to be mainly missiles, nuclear weapons, probably also some degree other weapons of mass destruction. And we don't know a great deal about what they do because they hide most of this behind secrecy. But we see snippets of it. We see stories of Iranians at the North Korean nuclear test last week, including potentially the head of the Iranian nuclear program. We see apparent cooperation that began at least a decade ago, recorded in the media, of at least hundreds of North Koreans in Iran working in their nuclear and rocket programs. We see the help that they gave to Syria. And we note that in these proliferation activities, even though, for example, after the 2006 nuclear test, President Bush said, okay, they did a nuclear test, but if they proliferate, well, we'll hold them to account. And then a year later, in September 2007, when Israel destroys the Syrian nuclear plant, nobody held North Korea to account for their contribution to that activity. It's easy to see why North Korea might think that it doesn't face much in the way of serious penalties for its nuclear weapons. North Korea wants these weapons potentially to level the playing field if it ever gets into a conflict. And you say, well, how could they possibly level the playing field? The United States has hundreds and hundreds of nuclear weapons. But how many nuclear weapons would have to be targeted on a U.S. city or a South Korean city before we might show some reluctance to use our own weapons? Or alternatively, let's say, heaven forbid, that someday North Korea uses a nuclear weapon against a South Korean city, and the U.S. goes to respond. Will an American president say, well, of course, I need to fire 100 nuclear weapons back at North Korea and kill 10 million innocent civilians to turn it into a parking lot. What American president is going to say that? Alternatively, what American president is going to say, I'm going to fire that 100 weapons at where the leadership might be so that I can destroy the leadership. But notice what happened with Kim Jong-un at the time of the test last week. He hadn't been seen, according to many media accounts, in 2 weeks. He didn't show up until later in the week. Very similar to the pattern that Kim Jong-il showed in many times in the past where he did a provocation. So how do you target in that kind of case? How do we establish deterrence in that kind of case? After all, does anyone here really want to see another North Korean nuclear test in the coming weeks or months? I certainly don't. Do we want to see more long-range rocket tests? No. But we need to posture deterrence against that. And those deterrents have to recognize the reality, which is, by and large, against those kinds of threats, we are not going to use military force. And our economic sanctions have gone about as far as they can go. I argue in that regard that we need to start thinking about political actions. But those political actions fundamentally have to be focused on the regime. That's what deterrence says. You don't deter Kim Jong-un by killing a battalion of soldiers. He might actually be delighted by that because that would cause the military to support him more. We need to focus on causing him costs directly. And that means political approaches. I'll stop there because I don't want to go too far into that, but I'd be happy to talk about that in the question period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Before moving on to Professor Michishita Narushige, maybe just one technical question. I mean, you did say, you did mention how secretive North Korea is and how it's, we're not really fully privy to exactly what they have. What do you make of the third nuclear test and their capability? I mean, how close are they?
Well, I think it's interesting that the traditional estimates of the yield of the second nuclear test were in the roughly 2 to 4 kiloton range. But about a year ago, the personnel associated with Dr. Sig Hecker at Stanford came out with statements that said that they thought that the models that had been used in those estimates were incorrect, and that if you used an alternative model, the estimates of the yield came in the 4 to 7 kiloton range. If you then look at the seismic reading of the test this time, 4.9 according to many of the sources here versus 4.5 for the second test, that suggests that the third test was 2.5 times the second test in magnitude, which would put it, if it's 4 to 7 is correct, in the 10 to 18 kiloton range. That's a very different estimate from 6 to 7. Now, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's the high end. But I think we have to recognize the fact that these are very highly uncertain. We're really guessing a little bit to a certain extent on what we can observe. But I don't think we should assume that this was yet another only marginal success. It may have been very successful. And in fact, I think we have to ask, when did they start testing miniaturized warheads? I mean, they claim they did it this time. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Did they also do it in 2009, or was it a primitive design? Those are things I think we have to ask.
Right. And of course, that point about their claim to the success of the miniaturization, obviously deployable on a delivery capability, is a source of major concern.
Sure.
Right. Professor Michishita Narushige, your take?
Thank you very much. Everybody, people on this floor apparently came here to hear about non-proliferation, but I'm not going to talk about non-proliferation because, one, because it's gone, two, because I think now at this point of time, counter-proliferation is maybe more important to talk about. And in this session, in the first half, I'll talk about North Korean, how we assess North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities, particularly its implications vis-a-vis Japan, and the scenarios that we kind of envision in which North Korea might use missiles against us. and then talk about military and diplomatic response that Japan has been taking to a growingly nuclearized North Korea. Okay, and the reason why, another reason why I talk about this, decided to talk about this topic is the fact that not many people know what Japan is doing to respond in response to this, and also when it comes to Japanese, when we people talk about Japanese response to North Korea, nuclear North Korea, people tend to talk about, oh, Japan is going nuclear, in response. That's not, it's very unrealistic, and there is much more to do. And before we go nuclear, we might, we don't know, but there is a lot that we have been doing outside, before nuclearization. First, let me talk about North Korea's nuclear capabilities. I mean, how many weapons? I don't know. Ask experts around in this room, but we estimate about 10, bombs, around 10 bombs. So that's the assumption. And by 2009, our estimate was that North Korea might have succeeded in miniaturizing those nuclear devices small enough to be mated with ballistic missiles, but we didn't know, and we kind of said, well, probably not, in order to kind of to feel good. But unfortunately, this time, this test seems to have been, conducted or done with a miniaturized version of a nuclear device, and if that's the case, North Korea can now mate nuclear devices with ballistic missiles. In terms of ballistic missiles, North Korea successfully launched this satellite launch vehicle, UNA-3, last December, and successfully put a satellite into orbit. So we tend to, our attention tends to be diverted to North Korea's growing potential capability to attack the U.S. mainland. But if you're kind of again return your attention to a more basic abilities, missile capabilities that they have. They have about 500 Scud missiles capable of reaching most of South Korean territories. And North Korea have 200 to 300 Nodon missiles capable of reaching most part of Japanese mainland. So North Korea has conducted Nodon tests many times in the past, including tests of variants of Nodon missiles by Iranians and Pakistanis. So we know that North Korea is capable of attacking Japan with missiles today. And if they have miniaturized nuclear bomb, our conclusions would be that North Korea is capable of attacking Japan with nuclear weapons today. Okay, what are the scenarios we kind of envisage in which North Korea might use missiles against us? There are three. One is what I call a military diplomatic use of missile force. In the situation where North Korea would like to, for example, normalize relations with us, we say no, you are bad, you are behaving badly, irresponsibly, and we are not gonna reward your bad behavior. And North Korea say, well, okay, then we launch missiles against you, and first maybe in the vicinity of your territorial waters, and it doesn't reach Tokyo, but the missile flies in the direction of Tokyo. And North Korea said, oh, our military people are furious about your hostile policy to us. If you don't come back to a negotiated table or respond positively to our overture to normalize relations, we would be forced by your action to escalate. So this is the first scenario. But the good news is that this first scenario is quite likely to happen, but damage that would be done to the Japanese lives and properties would be not that large, because North Korea would have to stop short of overdoing, how to say, doing the job. So, I mean, they would have to, scare Japanese leaders and people just enough to, force them into diplomatic submission. Second scenario is the Korean War scenario, in which war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula, and the U.S. force, United States, would be using Japanese U.S. bases in Japan in order to fight against North Korea. And North Korea naturally would regard it as a hostile action on the part of both the United States and Japan, and try to persuade Japanese government into not allowing the U.S. forces to use Japanese bases. In this case, probably intensity would be a little bit higher than the first scenario, because you are talking about war. This is a wartime situation, and likelihood of North Korean conventional attacks against major military bases in Japan, such as Kadena, Yokota, and things like that, Misawa. And also, North Korea would use a limited number of conventionally equipped missiles against some of the cities in order to scare Japanese people and leaders into diplomatic submission. And third scenario, this is the most scary, but not too high, likely scenario, is a desperate Kim Jong-un undertaking a suicidal attack against Japan. Okay, Kim Jong-un regime get destabilized, and he at some point come to realize that his days are numbered, but he would like to leave his legacy and his father, to inherit his father's and grandfather's will, to leave their names in the history of Korea, and by doing so take a historic revenge against Japan. And in this scenario, because this is suicidal, North Korea will be able to use as many nuclear weapons available, and as many as missiles that they have. So this is going to be very, very difficult situation. However, I don't think this is a highly likely scenario, because dictators tend to think until the final day that they would still survive, and resist the thinking of the fact, or thinking that their lives are numbered, or their government survival is numbered. So I don't think this will happen easily, but we have to kind of keep this in our mind. Okay, let me move to what we have been doing to respond to North Korea's nuclear and missile development. There are three pillars in our military response, which does not include an option to go nuclear. The first pillar is a ballistic missile defense system. The government of Japan decided to procure ballistic missile defense systems back in 2003, so it's been already 10 years, wow. And started to acquire them in 2007, and more or less finished deployment last year. And there are two systems. One is an Aegis destroyer-based SM-3 Standard 3 Block 1A, which is capable of taking on the missiles with a range of 1,500 kilometers or so also. And the second system is a ground-based Patriot PAC-3, which is a smaller coverage, but cheaper and more easy to handle. And so we have spent, we are spending a lot of money, and not many people know that we are doing a lot in addressing North Korean nuclear and missile capabilities. But we have spent $10 billion on this. This is a large amount of money. Okay, the second pillar is civil defense. In Korean, you call it minbanwi, and we call it national protection in Japanese, in order to be like, not sound too military. Anyway, so we have the Japanese parliament enacted a civil protection law back in 2004, And after that, different municipal governments have been kind of formulating action plans based on this law. And we have also created a warning system. There are two different systems. One is an emergency network, fax-based kind of network warning system, and the other is automated warning system called J-Alert. And since 2009, every time North Korea, announced or was going to launch missiles or rockets, we have activated these systems to warn Japanese people. And in past cases, there are a lot of problems. We have found out, in some cases, in 2009, we tried to activate the J-Alert, and not many, there are problems, and the alert didn't go off and things like that. But it's a kind of good learning process, and unless you try to use them, you don't know what kind of problems you might have. So this is, in a way, bad news, but good news for us. And the third pillar is to maintain and bolster, possibly, in the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence provided by the United States to Japan. And since 2008, when President Obama started to talk about, world without nuclear weapons, basically Japanese government and Japanese people welcomed the initiative. But at the same time, nuclear professional military strategists kind of a little bit got worried about its possible negative consequences, because if you reduce certain type of nuclear weapons in certain ways, that might undermine the credibility of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence provided to Japan. So we've been consulting with the U.S. government on this issue, and we have kind of asked them to consult with us when they take any important steps on nuclear reduction. And also, we have been urging the U.S. government to provide more information as to their nuclear forces and nuclear war plans to us. Finally, on the diplomatic front, you have to actually better ask Ambassador Endo, but I'll just touch briefly on what we have been doing. Our assumption is that North Korea is not, willing to, not trying to fight with us or attack us. That's not their objective. Their objective is to normalize relations with us and get a large amount of money from us. And on that assumption, Prime Minister Koizumi visited North Korea and met Kim Jong-il to cut a deal in which, while North Korea kind of addressed the issue of nuclear weapons, missiles, and abduction issues, if they kind of resolve those issues, we would be willing to normalize relations with North Korea and provide a pretty large amount of assistance package. It didn't work, unfortunately, for two reasons. Because it was the time when it was revealed that North Korea was secretly conducting uranium enrichment. And also, the fact was revealed that abducted Japanese citizens, some of them, actually many of them, were dead. And upon that, North Korean authorities provided us with kind of fake certificate of their death. So we saying, what are you doing? We can't accept this, and it went nowhere. And the Japan DPRK relationship further deteriorated when North Korea conducted the first nuclear test in October 2006, and just after that, then Prime Minister Abe, who is a Prime Minister now, decided to impose a unilateral sanction against North Korea, and which unfortunately ended up isolating Japan in the six-party framework, because just after Japanese government imposed these unilateral sanctions, apart from UN's resolutions, UN sanctions, the US government decided to change their mind and started to proactively engage in talks in dialogue with North Korea, and so we got isolated. And and this situation lasted for 3 years. But fortunately and unfortunately, North Korean provocations continued, and the US government and South Korean government became kind of tough again. And we remained tough on North Korea for, throughout the process. So, South Koreans, the United States, so in a way, came back to, to kind of came closer to our position. So our position, we can coordinate policies more effectively. Anyway, but now they have conducted a third test, and we are kind of wondering whether that would result or lead to a further imposition of sanctions or change in mind in the government in Seoul and Washington, and result in some kind of talks with North Korea. So we will find out. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Michishita. So the fourth flag is not a possibility at all for Japan in terms of nuclear Japan in response to the continuing threat coming from North Korea?
Well, I think another option that we have been talking about is possessing strike capabilities, conventional strike capabilities, constituted by possession of. Already we have attack aircraft called F-2s, and we have already procured aerial refueling aircraft, and we have a JDAM, Joint Direct Attack Munition. So we have already acquired a rudimentary capability to conduct attack operations, strike operations, but we haven't, our men have not, pilots have not conducted, the bombing operations too much, and we have only the rudimentary. So the first option would be to have a more robust strike capabilities.
Yeah, I mentioned that because
that would cost a lot of money again.
Yeah, because in Korea, of course, as you may imagine, there's quite a bit of a discussion now about the nuclear capability. In the least, maybe bringing back the tactical nuclear weapons. So maybe we can leave that to the discussion session when we engage with the audience. Finally, we have Mr. Alexander Vorontsov. Would you like to, if you can maybe make it, because we are working with some time constraints as well, so maybe not too long, if you don't mind.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleague, of course, I'm very happy to be here and thank Asan Institute for invitation at this great event. I will try to be short, but God knows. Of course, we just now, after the nuclear test which North Korea conducted a few days ago, the situation aggravated, and the spirit and our feelings, of course, just now are not very good. And at the same time, this third nuclear test, and our reaction gives the grounds to conclude that, unfortunately, we continue to move along the vicious circles. And just now we are entering the new circles of this not very happy movement. And one of the reasons why we continue to be in this track, reiterating track of the vicious circles, is maybe, not maybe, but definitely, it's misperception, miscalculation from both sides, from North Korean side and from our sides, of our intention, of our concern, and so on. Look, what just now discussed, first of all, and it's quite logical, the punishment for North Korea. They should understand that they will lose something. And new sanctions, of course, will be adopted. New hard, tough resolution will be adopted, more or less, but more tough. And quite predictable the reaction of North Korea. They will reject this condemnation, they will reject this resolution as usual, and they will continue to argue that it is double standards, and etc. And they will continue to develop their nuclear and missile program. And what we have in result? We try and we want to find the way how to persuade North Korea, how to force North Korea to conduct in more right direction, to conduct in more safe and less provocative way. But look, sometimes we succeed to achieve this result. And in last session, for example, Mr. Joel Witt reminded us that during 7 years, North Korea exercised missile test moratorium, yeah? And the agreed framework during 8 years was respected by North Korea also. And it was great achievement. But how much we appreciate these achievements? Sometimes I have a feeling that we take it for granted as assessed as something not very considerable, not very important. Moreover, when North Korea began to conduct themselves in more peaceful way, in more acceptable for us way, we frequently assessed it not as a result of some change in Pyongyang, not as a result of their coming back to the common sense, not as a result of their movement in the right direction. We assessed it as not their achievement, but as our achievement of our hardline policy. Their good behavior we accept as a demonstration of their weakness, that our hard policy, pressure policy is working, and therefore they began to conduct themselves in another way. And following this logic, what we conclude, if this pressure policy is working, we should continue it. And we not accommodate their more constructive behavior in a more positive way to engage them in some serious negotiation. But we decide that we should continue our pressure policy because in this way we will achieve more concession from North Korea's side. And what we had in the previous stage, the previous circle of this visual circle game, we remember that there are a lot of examples. For example, you mentioned the visit of Mr. Koizumi to Pyongyang in 2002. Historical visit. Historical by many points, from many points of view, and one of the important is that Kim Jong-il recognized the abduction problem. It was very important and very hard, first of all, from domestic policy point of view for North Korea, to accept it, to recognize, yes, we kidnapped Japanese people. And how it was assessed, how it was accepted in Japan as a very difficult for North Korea, but important step in the right direction, which opens a new opportunity to achieve the problem. Unfortunately not. It was used to demonize North Korea. Oh, we understand that you are more bad guys than we think before, than we thought before. You recognized that you kidnapped Japanese people. And this opportunity was closed for a long time, unfortunately. What we had in the nuclear missile track in the last 2 years, we remember that in 2009, North Korea withdrew from six-party talk and told that will never return. And all party involved, I mean six-party talk participants, told that the most important goal is to return North Korea into six-party talk. Finally, and first of all, thanks to Chinese and Russian diplomacy, we really persuade North Korea to come back to six-party talk, and Kim Jong-il repeatedly told, yes, we are ready to come back. And what happened? South Korea, United States were in a hurry to accommodate this. No. On the rhetoric level, yes, six-party talks restarting is our goal. But on the level of practical policy, we met that these capitals put forward the precondition. Before six-party talk will restart, North Korea should fulfill this. Then precondition received a little bit another less irritating formulation, pre-steps. But everybody, first of all, North Korea understood that it's a demonstration of reluctance in the practical way, reluctance of Washington and Seoul and Tokyo to restart six-party talks. Why? Because this country were satisfied with the previous policy of the isolation and pressure of North Korea, so called the strategic patience conception, which many American experts call as one sort of the containment policy. And nobody was in a hurry to change this strategic patience policy. And North Korea finally, just now, it's not to excuse North Korea, of course, but to understand better their logic. Because I have, maybe I'm mistaken, but I have impression frequently that we misunderstood and miscalculate real North Korean perception. They were totally disappointed, and they understood that they have nothing to wait from their counterparts, that they don't want them to see in six-party talks as an equal partner. They use this policy and this game of the involvement of North Korea into six-party talks as a pretext for the hidden agenda, as a cover for the hidden agenda, which the real policy is a strategic patience. Yeah? And it was one of the, I think, crucially important motivation for North Korea to conduct the third nuclear test. 3 days before they did it, I had a meeting with a high-ranked North Korean diplomat in Moscow, and I asked him, is some chance for, not to fulfill their warning? I told him maybe if you will be offered some really substantial talk with a real serious agenda, maybe we will reconsider your decision. I asked him how many percentage he think for fulfillment of their warning to conduct nuclear test. I told him 50%, 70, 90, 95%. He answered me 100%. 100%, we will do it. I asked why you are so sure. He told that because we will not do nuclear test, United States negative policy towards us will not change. Nothing to lose. What's their perception? We are discussing now what we should persuade them. They should understand that they will lose something. But their perception is nothing to lose. The situation for them is so bad that nothing can be more worse. And another point, unfortunately, once again, quite frequently, we regard their so-called good behavior as a demonstration of their weakness, as a demonstration of their readiness to go and to give more and more concessions. And they're warning that they will finally do something. Response in more hard way is interpreted as a bluff. When we remember warn that they will create nuclear weapons, for a long time we accepted it as a bluff. When they warned, for example, on the eve of the very tragic event, Yonpyeong-do shelling, they warned South Koreans, yes, during your military exercise, please do not open fire, missile fire to the sea. We will respond. But South Korea side told that it's bluff. And such kind of policy and perceptions force them to prove that it's not bluff, that they should do something real, practical one, to make clear to counterparts that they are really concerned with their situation and they will continue the development, what they call the deterrence potential, because it's only one way for them to protect and to provide their survival. And sometimes we underestimate. It's quite clear, obvious thing, but we underestimate this very simple thing. That they really, we speak about intimidation of the blackmail. Yes, it's true, but it's part of the truth. Another part of the truth is that they also feel themselves threatened, every day threatened, by the possibility of the military attack and even maybe nuclear one. For example, I understand very well mispleasure of our South Korean friends when North Korean don't want to speak, to discuss with them nuclear agenda. We remember Mr. Liebenberg government approach, the nuclearization first of North Korea and $3,000 per capita. Yes, for North Korea, something else. But the nuclearization first. It's unacceptable for them, very simple. They really, it's not propaganda, they really perceive the nuclear problem as a problem between the only North Korea and United States. And not other participants are relevant in this game. It's not propaganda. For example, when I visited the foreign ministry, what, for example, in Russia, in all countries of six-party talks, we call the nuclear problem of North Korea in a little bit different way, yes? Some calls nuclear problem of North Korea, Russia, Chinese foreign embassy officially calls it the nuclear problem of Korean Peninsula, and so on and so on. But North Korean foreign ministry calls it a nuclear problem of United States and North Korea. And they have the special department. It's not for propaganda, it's for their internal using. When I was in their foreign ministry and asked about this problem, they told, oh, it's question concern our colleagues from the Chomi Hekmunjebu. Chomi Hekmunjebu. It's for their domestic perceptions. Department of North Korea, Choson, yes, and the United States nuclear problem. So, and coming back to our main topic of our session, just now after the nuclear test, there are a lot of assessments, very interesting one and different one. And for me, for example, understandable include some appeal and some experts of the United States who argue that United States needs to make one step behind and to reconsider what happened. Why strategic patience policy failed to fulfill the goals, yes, to stop the nuclear problem of North Korea, program of North Korea. And some American experts argue that just now United States should concentrate and focus their attention, first of all, not on the disarmament talk with North Korea, but non-proliferation talk, and to discuss maybe in some private format the real red lines for practical red lines for the proliferation, possible proliferation activity. I think it's very timely. I think it's grounded approach. Thank you, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vorontsov. I would take your discussions to mean how difficult it would be to be really genuinely talking about denuclearization of North Korea. I would, however, beg to actually differ on your take on the six-party talks in terms of all these preconditions being applied. That's not the case at all. I think we know precisely what the six-party talks were. It was about dismantling North Korean nuclear weapons program. They knew that fully well, and there were lots of discussions, including I think we remember the disabling of the nuclear program, and in return for that, there were lots of goodies that were offered to North Korea. So it's totally up to North Korea to have abandoned, shunned this six-party talks, which of course was hosted by China. So to say that there were too many conditions applying to North Korea, that North Korea simply had no choice but to abandon it, that it felt threatened. I mean, that's precisely what it was, to make sure that North Korea does not in any way feel threatened, despite giving up its nuclear weapons, was the point about the six-party talks. And they shunned it because they didn't want to give up the nuclear weapons, simple as that. But we are actually, as I said, constricted by time. So rather than us panelists having this, discussions, I would now just open up to the audience to ask very quick, specific questions so that we can have several Q&As. Yes, please identify yourselves and address whoever you want to.
Realmer Yang Yi from China. I have a very quick question for each of you. First, for U.S., between the disarm the nuclear capability of DPRK and non-proliferation, which one is more important for U.S.? For Japan, if every parties agree to return to the six-party talk table, will Japan still insist that abdication is a precondition? For Russia, if U.S. refuse to provide the active, negative security guarantee to DPRK, will Russia really want to volunteer to provide active security guarantee alone or in teamwork with China?
Yeah. I'm going to take actually few questions before we get back to the panelists.
Could I get you to repeat your question? Because I didn't understand it.
Okay. Between the disarmed DPRK's nuclear capability and the non-proliferation efforts, which one is more important for us?
Yeah. You had a question? Yeah.
One question for Bruce Bennett, which is how exactly would the United States reduce North Korea to a parking lot given the constraints on the delivery of its nuclear weapons, realistically? Secondly, what nuclear weapons could the United States possibly reintroduce to South Korea, given that the only available bomb is in Europe, committed to a NATO mission, and they cost each bomb about the equivalent in gold to modernize at the moment? We don't have a budget to do that even for the European theater. And then I have a question for our Russian colleague, which was in the institutional working group of the six-party talks, which Russia chaired, were there serious discussions about an enduring institutional framework for managing nuclear insecurities or security issues with North Korea after their disarmament? Was there actual serious institutional discussion with North Korea in that context?
After what?
After what institutional frameworks did Russia, as the chair of that group, put on the table with North Korea after they denuclearized? What was envisioned as the institutional framework?
Okay. We'll take one more question before getting back to the panelists, and then hopefully we'll have a second round. Yeah, please.
I was hearing you very intently when you were listing out the uses that a country like North Korea puts to its nuclear weapons. And listening to you, I thought that if one was to replace, North Korea with another country from my region, and I come from India, it would still apply to that. So what I'm pointing out to you is that there is a pattern of political utility of nuclear weapons. One understands that there is no military utility of the weapon, but it's being put to use in a political manner. And there are more countries which are likely to see that political utility and go down that path. Now, given that the name of the session is non-proliferation and beyond, I'm wondering whether you see any role of universal nuclear disarmament as one of the ways of, getting to the heart of this problem.
Okay, back to the panelists. Bruce, you want to take the questions first?
Okay. I personally don't feel that we're ever going to denuclearize North Korea. So I would put much of our negotiating focus on more on countering proliferation. But I have to say, what do we do in that regard? I mean, proliferation's already actively going on, as best we can tell, with Iran and with other countries, as best we can tell. There are North Korean connections. So on the parking lot and how we would do that, you got to make some decisions about what you're prepared to do. If I were going to attack North Korea with nuclear weapons, I would probably use bombers. I would not use ICBMs or SLBMs. Getting the required number of weapons down, 100 nuclear weapons changing it in a parking lot makes no sense. It's not a smart idea. The attack nukes from Europe, those would potentially be usable, but as you say, it's a huge hassle to try to move them, take a long time. Bombers is the most responsive. On political utility, I think, yeah, absolutely there's political utility. And that affects our willingness to, or our ability to get a country to give up these weapons. Having said that, I'm not sure that there's no military utility. I don't think Kim Jong-un is going to wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to blow up the United States or I'm going to blow up South Korea. But if he wakes up tomorrow and says, the military is about to overthrow me, what can I do to unify the military in terms of a diversionary war kind of concept? Is he at that stage prepared to use weapons? Or like his father said in 1993, when he said, if North Korea loses a war, I will be sure to destroy the earth. What good is the earth without North Korea? I mean, that's a threat, admittedly, but is it also ingrained in operational concepts?
Mr. Vorontsov, there was a question.
No, first, about active guarantee. No, I'm not sure. As you know, our treaty, which we concluded with North Korea in 2000 year, is excluded the military-related charter and our guarantee. It's the normal treaty about the neighborhood, friendship, cooperation. And frankly speaking, I'm not sure that it's so relevant and practically efficient, because for North Koreans, their perceptions, they understood that only one country in the world can give, is possible, able to give the real guarantee of security. It's the United States. And once again, I would like to remind my talk with another high-ranked North Korean diplomat in Moscow. 10 days before they withdrew from Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was very end of 2002, and you remember in January 10th of 2003 they withdrew. But situation developed in the negative direction, agreed framework collapsed, and tension between United States and North Korea raised drastically. And I argue, we had a tete-a-tete talk, and I told the North Korea colleague that if you will withdraw from Non-Proliferation Treaty, you will meet very, very painful consequences, and I enumerated first, some second. And he told me, I was surprised a little bit, he told me, I agree with your analysis totally, we definitely will meet these painful consequences. And the question is not a non-proliferation treaty, it's a good treaty, we respect this treaty, but the question is, if the United States will decide to attack us, nobody will protect us. Will we remain inside of non-proliferation treaty, or we will withdraw from non-proliferation treaty? It will not help us. And nobody, he told, not Russia, not China, nobody can protect us, not UN. Only we by ourselves can protect us. And we should do something. There is a logic. And the perception of possibility of attack from the side of the United States, at least that time, I am afraid that now also is really a serious perception in North Korea.
Okay,
So only United States are able to give effective, efficient guarantee. And about the Russian-chaired group inside of six-party talk, it deals with the peace regime on Korean Peninsula. And as I know, and I know the chief of this group, he very serious in elaboration of the different projects of peace regime construction after denuclearization, or simultaneously with the process of denuclearization. Of course, it's a long time. If it possible, it will be not during one night indeed. But yes, in case of very optimistic scenario, the most optimistic scenario realization, if we will achieve the denuclearization of North Korea, of course it will be raised as a question, six-party talk mechanism, is it fulfilled their task and should be dismissed, or it's maybe useful platform for continuation? And the idea, of course, it's not only Russia idea, it's not something special. Many, and we know South Korean colleagues elaborated this problem very seriously, that the idea is a continuation, to use the six-party talk as some basic ground for expansion of this institution and preventing our developing it in some kind of the permanent mechanisms for Northeast Asia security issue discussion.
Okay.
It's the idea.
Thank you. There was one final...
Abduction question. Abduction question.
Oh, okay.
I have a question. Yeah. Abduction, progress on abduction issue has never been a precondition for us, for Japan to go back to the six-party talks. Rather, progress on abduction issue was a precondition for Japan to finance energy assistance, provision of energy assistance to North Korea. I don't know whether we will be able to separate these two in a possible next round of six-party talks. I hope we can. But Abe, I know at the same time that Mr. Abe has a pressure on his shoulders not to be too soft on North Korea.
Okay. There's a sign in the back that presses me to end this panel, a line that I dare not cross. Obviously, for North Korea, there's been plenty of red lines, which they fail to upkeep. So it's really not a time. I think clearly the third nuclear test just conducted, there's a very different feel to it than the first and the second. I think there's a growing public sentiment, certainly here in Korea, that enough is enough. It's not a time to talk about drawing new red lines. Red line has already been crossed. So the onus falls on South Korea, Japan, even Russia, the international community, certainly China, the United States, as to now what do we do about it? Okay? We talk about denuclearization, non-proliferation. Well, talk is cheap.
Yeah.
Okay? Obviously, things have not worked so far. So if you're not going to put things into action, then we might as well not talk about denuclearization or non-proliferation. So on that somber note, I'm afraid we're out of time, so we'll end this panel. I'm sure there will be plenty more panels to be discussing same issues. So thank you very much for the three panelists for excellent presentations.
This concludes our second session. We will now have a 15-minute coffee break. Thank you very much.